Few film genres are as synonymous with sequels as the wider world of horror, with the relatively low production costs of these movies, meaning it's pretty easy to spin a solid profit. And what does solid profit so often mean? Why, that means a return to the well for another go around. Even if a film isn't exactly great, time and time again we've seen sequel after sequel after prequel after reimagining after reconfigurations or whatever the buzzword of the day is. But on the flip side, there are those great horror efforts that always felt deserving of a sequel, and in some cases there may even have been tentative plans for one, but here we are, years after their release and not a follow-up in sight. So with that in mind, I'm Andrew from What Culture Horror, and here are the horror movies that deserve a sequel, but will never get one. The Belko Experiment. One of the most important figures in the game these days, James Gunn has quite the varied resume when it comes to his writing work, from the early, glorious days of Troma Hey Uncle Lloydie, to his more recent superhero spectacle that was Superman, and somewhere in the middle of this resume, Gunn wrote 2014's The Belko Experiment, a horror film based in a high-rise office where employees are ordered to kill their co-workers until only one remains. Long-time colleagues turn on each other, close friends turn on each other, lovers turn on each other until the resourceful Mike is the last person standing, putting an end to that twisted contest. Only this is not the end. This isn't even the beginning of the end, but this is the end of the beginning, to borrow a line from Jake the Snake Roberts, as it's revealed that a whole bunch of similar experiments are being conducted across the world, all leading to what's referred to as Stage 2. Even without that sequel bait, the Belko Experiment had plenty of potential to grow. I mean, think of that same sort of competition taking place at, I don't know, for example, a sporting event, in a prison, heck, at a wedding even. A sequel could look at so many different scenarios, or it could delve deep into Belko's origins and their ultimate endgame for all of this. But nah, over a decade later, the Belko Experiment, it remains a one and done. The Final Girls. Much like the Belko Experiment, it's now somehow over 10 years since Todd Strauss-Schulzen's The Final Girls released, and truth be told, this is one of my outright favourite movies of the 2010s, period. A brilliant love letter to the slashes of the 1980s, poking fun at those familiar tropes, yet having a poignant emotional core to the film. As for that emotional core, things kick off in traumatic fashion as Max, played by the brilliant Tysa Farmiga, sees her mother Amanda die in a car wreck, her mother having become a struggling actor who's been typecast after playing classic screen queen Nancy in 1986 slasher Camp Bloodbath. Skipping ahead 3 years, the still grieving Max is convinced by her friends to go out and watch a double feature of Camp Bloodbaths 1 and 2, and when a fire breaks out in the cinema, the group make a hole in the screen to escape, only to wake up in Camp Bloodbath. Of course, the group is eager to get the hell out of Dodge and make it back home, but there's a sense of conflict in Max as she kinda gets to see her mother again, albeit as Nancy. The Final Girls is a brilliant blend of horror, humour, and a whole dose of heart, and the general concept still has so much left on the table, with there plenty to deconstruct and poke fun at from general horror sequels. And on top of that, co-writer MA14 had previously talked about an idea for The Final Girls 2, which would bring in Max's father. Still, a sequel has yet to happen, and MA14 has instead been busy with, that awful Russell Crowe exorcism movie, yeesh. Event Horizon. Paul W.S. Anderson may have returned time and time again with his Resident Evil movies, but it would have been nice to see him revisit 1997's Event Horizon at some point over the years. This cosmic terror offering finds a rescue team of astronauts investigating an eerie spaceship called, it's called the Event Horizon, a ship that vanished then mysteriously reappeared years later, and over time this group discovers that the Event Horizon opened a gateway to hell, turning the vessel into some sinister conduit. Just before the Event Horizon returns to hell, Captain Miller, played by Lawrence Fishburne, ejects the front of the ship, allowing the surviving crew to escape. Kind of, as it soon becomes clear that the survivors have been traumatized and corrupted by the evil. Granted, Event Horizon tanked at theaters and received mixed reviews, at best that's being generous, but it's been reappraised in more recent years. Plus, it would have been fun to see what happened next, as in where would the possessed ship go? Would it head to Earth? Could it start to infect mankind? Would a corrupt company try to weaponize the use of personal gain? Well, yeah, of course they would. The years have seen rumblings of a sequel, a prequel, and a TV series for Event Horizon, but nope, nothing has ever come to pass. Behind the Mask, the rise of Leslie Vernon. The term found footage can be enough to send a chill down the spine of many a long-time horror fan. Sure, the Blair Witch Project was a huge success, a game changer, viral before viral was a thing, when that released back in 1999. But of course, Blair Witch popularised found footage, leading to a whole host of awful films that attempted to catch that lightning in a bottle. But while there have been some decent to good other found footage movies, one that kinda flies under the radar a little, at least to mainstream audiences, is Behind the Mask: The Rise of Leslie Vernon, which is a found footage slash mockumentary slash straight up slasher movie. Here we have a documentary crew following Leslie Vernon, a budding serial killer looking to follow in the footsteps of the likes of Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, as Leslie explains the rules, tropes and meticulous planning that go into choosing his victims, to assessing surroundings and just being one step ahead of the game. Things become more of a traditional horror movie when Leslie actually starts to pile up the bodies, spinning the film into a more conventional slasher film. As an idea, that was a great one, being fully self-aware while also being genuinely unsettling. Director Scott Glosserman did toy with a sequel for a decade or so, but ultimately he felt that his ideas had become outdated and thus decided to pull the plug. The Void. Pulling plenty of Lovecraftian influence, The Void sees a small-town police officer and a handful of survivors trapped in a hospital after the building is surrounded by a cult. And just when things can't get any worse, some of the hospital's patients transform into otherworldly creatures. The Void was genuinely gripping, genuinely nightmare fuel, and it only scratched the surface of the lore that future films could dive into, particularly as the fate of key characters was left unknown, and our two leads ended up in a different dimension, emphasizing that their story, it was far from over. It also has to be highlighted that The Void was made on less than $83,000, so it is hugely intriguing to think of what else could be achieved in a sequel with a slightly bigger budget, yeah? Freddy vs. Jason. The idea of pitting a Nightmare on Elm Street's Freddy Krueger and Friday the 13th Jason Voorhees against one another, that's an idea that first properly came together back in 1987. However, it would take a further 16 years before Freddy vs. Jason finally hit the silver screen in 2003. And not only was this a fun popcorn slasher for genre fans to enjoy, but most importantly, of course, it did a whole lot of big business, taking home nearly $120 million at the box office and being the highest grossing installment of either franchise. And so, not just was a follow-up picture soon in the works, but this next movie would bring in the Evil Dead's Ashley J. Williams for what would have been simply titled Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash. As for why this sequel didn't come to pass, at least in movie form, that's because Bruce Campbell and New Line Cinema had those ever familiar creative differences. Basically, Campbell lost interest when he learned that Ash wasn't allowed to kill either Freddy or Jason, and with that, the project was scrapped. Still, the story of Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash was later reworked into a 2007 comic book series by Wildstorm and Dynamite Entertainment, itself being followed by its own sequel tale in 2009, which was Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, The Nightmare Warriors. Society. From the great Brian Usner, Society is an ooey-gooey body horror dripping with satire as the rich and elite are revealed to be a shape-shifting, shunting species that quite literally feed off the lower classes. And by the end of the movie, our lead Bill has just about managed to fend off this otherworldly cult, escaping with his love interest Clarissa, who's also part of that species, and their pal Milo. However, that's precisely what these characters have done, escaped. The cult is still going strong, in fact their party of excess is still raging on as Society's credits hit, leaving the door wide open for a sequel. Still, we've never had a sequel, despite director Brian Usner telling Fangoria back in 2023 how there had been talks over the years of a straight up sequel movie or even a TV series, but nothing has ever happened. Tucker and Dale vs. Evil. Speaking of movies that bombed upon release, Tucker and Dale vs. Evil may have bombed spectacularly back in 2010, but it's since received a whole lot of love for how it flips the conventions of how horror heroes and villains are portrayed. Here, our eponymous hillbillies are mistaken for murderous kidnappers, with them doing all they can to prove their innocence, as their behaviour is constantly misconstrued in a way that leads to plenty of ridiculousness and gory hijinks. The initial failure of Tucker and Dale vs. Evil doomed any chance of a sequel getting greenlit back then, That is, until 4 years later, when director Eli Craig announced a follow-up titled Tucker and Dale Go to Yale was being mapped out, with Tucker star Alan Tudyk even comparing the structure of the film to be similar to Robert Rodriguez's From Dusk Till Dawn. At least that was the aim, the hope. Although Tudyk and fellow lead Tyler Labine continued to be busy with other projects, they insisted that Tucker and Dale Go to Yale was still in active development for years, while until 2017 saw Alan Tudyk say that he didn't expect the project to ever see the light of day, despite a script being finished. Planet Terror. Speaking of Robert Rodriguez, 2007 saw the release of his and Quentin Tarantino's Grindhouse doubleheader, serving as a throwback to the exploitation movies of the 1970s. And for Rodriguez, his Planet Terror was a whole lot of fun, embracing over-the-top zombie gore, pulpy action, and plenty of self-aware humour. Not to mention, it had a pretty darn sweet soundtrack to boot, an absolute banging one. Unfortunately, the whole Grindhouse concept died a slow death at the box office, particularly Planet Terror. Still, the movie has developed a cult following in the years since its release, and given how Rodriguez has never been shy of a sequel, it'd be cool to see Planet Terror getting some sort of follow-up. And by the end of that film, Cherry Darling has gone from go-go dancer to unapologetic badass, with a machine gun for a leg no less, with that ending feeling less like a conclusion and more like a launchpad for not just that character, but a wider Planet Terror franchise. Still, even though the hardcore fanbase would love to see Planet Terror 2, there's been total radio silence of us ever getting one, which is a massive shame. They Live. The late great Rowdy Roddy Piper was here to chew bubblegum and kick ass in John Carpenter's iconic They Live back in 1988, starring as John Nadder in this scathing slice of social commentary. Nadder is a drifter, simply looking to make it through each day, to earn an honest wage, and to get a warm meal in his belly. But things take a dramatic turn when Nadder discovers a pair of special sunglasses that reveal an alien conspiracy where subliminal messages are being used to control mankind. This was Carpenter's response to the political unrest of the US during the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, growing commercialization of anything and everything, something that still resonates in so many ways through to this very day in 2026. Now, the original movie wrapped up with Nadder exposing this alien conspiracy worldwide, but the sequel could focus on the aftermath of this, the global repercussions of such a revelation, what that means for humanity. There's also plenty of unanswered questions, like how long have the aliens walked amongst us? What famous figures throughout history were aliens in disguise? Which world leaders were in on it all along? John Carpenter did actually consider a They Live 2, though sadly he had difficulty finding finances or simply the interest for any such project to move forward. And while it was announced in 2010 that Carpenter would serve as a producer on a They Live remake, a remake that saw Matt Reeves attached as director the following year, all's been extremely quiet since then, bar some 2023 quotes from producer Sandy King that a sequel, a remake, or a new adaptation of the source material might still happen at some point, possibly.